Save the world from a frickin' alien invasion in Earth Defense Force 4.1, The Shadow of New Despair. Is blasting bugs better with a bestie? EDF looks somewhat dated. The graphics lack detail and often appear flat, with sharp edges and noticeable polygons. But there's a hell of a lot of charm in the style that recalls the fun of playing some of the best classic PS2 and PS3 games. There's a great sense of scale, with large environments, spectacular explosions, and hundreds of giant bug parts ragdolling all over the place. The giant enemies stand out among the environments without looking like they're too out of place. The animations don't always match their size, making the insects crawling over buildings look a bit goofy. But it adds to the campy charm of the visuals that fits perfectly in with the overall atmosphere of the game. The effects of large explosions are fantastic, and the abundance of fast-moving enemies tidal waving toward you can be quite terrifying, whether in sun-drenched outdoor environments or in underground tunnels where your bright projectiles eerily light up unseen enemies in the dark.
Earth Defense Force is an arcadey, mission-based third-person shooter where you fight giant bugs, giant robots, and flying alien spacecraft that are terrorizing cities around the world. You begin by choosing one of 4 classes and 2 of the numerous weapons tied to that class. Each of the classes play very differently, with their own weapons and unique skills. Ranger is the standard class, supposedly recommended for beginners, with decent armor and mobility compared to the other ground-based classes. Wing Diver is able to move much faster than the other classes, but comes with the cost of movement and ammo being tied to the same energy supply and subject to a cooldown phase. Air Raiders have more limited direct combat capabilities, and act more as a support class, able to call air raids and summon vehicles. Finally, Fencer is the slowest but most powerful class, recommended only for advanced players. The variety of classes and how they differ is great for replayability and anyone who is interested in continually changing up how they play. But honestly, once you get used to the speed and mobility of the Wing Diver, it's hard to shift back to any of the other, relatively slower classes. It's just too useful and too much fun to be able to fly all over the map taking on whatever objective needs your attention, rather than having to trudge on foot. But whatever class you choose, throughout each mission you'll have the opportunity to pick up armor and new weapons from many of the enemies you kill, which will increase your max health for future missions and possibly grant you access to different or better weapons for your class. Even if you stick with one class, the weapon variety alone will keep it interesting for much of the game. Many of the weapons feel very different to use, and it's fun to experiment with your loadout to identify which ones are best for which mission type, or which ones you just enjoy using the most. The third-person shooting mechanics are solid and satisfying. It's nice to play a shooting game that doesn't rely on precise aiming and split-second decisions. The size and quantity of enemies means that generally, if you shoot anywhere near a target, you're going to hit something. Maybe even a huge building that crumbles to the ground. You have unlimited ammo, and your firepower is only slowed down by the need to occasionally reload or cool down your weapon. In this sense, the Wing Diver class can be initially tricky, as overheating your energy supply results in a lengthy cooldown where you won't be able to shoot or quickly retreat.
Although the class and weapon options keep the variety high on the gameplay front, the game is actually quite long, and can sometimes feel repetitive with strings of similar missions with objectives that rarely amount to more than kill everything on the map. The occasional boss fights up the spectacle, even when you don't think it could get any crazier, but most of the missions involve simply fighting the basic enemies in one of a handful of environments. At least these few environments do feel quite different. Canyons and cities add verticality to fights. Flat beaches with enemies invading from the horizon increase the sense of scale for battles, and underground tunnels are dark and terrifying as you dive deeper into unknown territory. All of the missions are a blast, but once you've seen a few, there are rarely any surprises in the campaign. The scale and spectacle of the game are excellent, but there are some drawbacks. Namely, it can be too chaotic at times. Dead bugs and their body parts fly across the map and litter the ground, sometimes even trapping players under them until they disappear. It's also difficult to distinguish between what's alive and dead in order to focus your attacks. Enemies can swarm from literally every angle, such that there's no path for escape, and the various ways they attack can leave you unsure of where damage is coming from. The map is very useful for finding where enemies and pickups are, but it's useless for navigation in the longer tunnel missions, as it doesn't indicate paths.
Each time you start up the game, it asks how many players there are, so there's no ambiguity about how to start a co-op game. As far as I'm concerned, this sends a clear message that the local co-op experience has equal fitting with the single-player experience. Progress is shared between the co-op and single-player modes, so it's possible to continue the game without a second player if necessary, and for any player to grind out previous levels for weapons and armor pickups to make future co-op sessions easier. The local co-op features vertical split screen, with a surprisingly good field of view so neither player feels cramped. Players can spend a mission working closely together or can act independently, taking out different sets of enemies on opposite sides of the map. Friendly fire is always on, but at lower difficulty levels it's not really a problem, especially if players split up or just try to avoid shooting at each other. You can revive a downed teammate simply by standing near them and pressing a button, but it does involve sacrificing half of your health. Luckily, there's no timer associated with the revive mechanic, so there's no added urgency. One of the only real downsides to co-op is it can be difficult to revive a player if the action in a mission is particularly heavy, so there's a chance one player might be out of action for minutes at a time. Fortunately, we rarely found it to be a problem, as the game is fairly easy on the normal difficulty. We imagine the easy difficulty would be accessible for any experience level, and it's easy for a more experienced player to pick up the slack if necessary.
There's no traditional leveling up, but armor and weapon pickups are tied to class, and therefore help any player that chooses that class in a future mission. In this way, both players progress at the same pace. Neither player is prioritized, either in gameplay or in the menus. Both players have full control of the main menu and have the ability to pause the game. They can choose any class for a given mission, and customize their characters independently with their choice of weapon loadout and even change their armor color. Missions varied pretty widely in length, and there's no real indication of how long a mission will take before you start it. We didn't find any mission was too long by itself, never more than 20 minutes, so the game can be decent for short sessions, but the amount of missions you can complete in those sessions might vary. The title of Earth Defense Force 4.1 might make you think this is the fourth game in a series, but in fact it's a remake of the second game in the series. It's still a sequel to a game that isn't available on current-gen systems, and therefore there's a bit of barrier to getting into the story. It's a fairly simple story though, and it doesn't feel like there's any necessary information missing. There are some references to the previous game that provide some obvious details that you could probably guess, but you get the sense that this is one of those more of the same sequels that can pretty much stand on its own. The story involves an apparent second attempt by aliens to invade Earth. You play as a member of the Earth Defense Force, tasked with putting a stop to the invasion by killing hundreds of giant bugs, robots, and alien spaceships of all sizes. The story is told mostly through mission briefings and large amounts of radio chatter during missions. It can be hard to follow conversations while you're fighting for your life, but the amount of missions leads to story beats being repeated or explained over multiple missions. It progresses pretty slowly, and there are rarely any complicated twists. As a result, it's not always interesting either, but it does its job of giving the player appropriate tasks and goals, and it can be a lot of fun to follow along if you like classic campy sci-fi films.
For the most part, the game runs well, with no crashes or anything that halted our progress. There were several instances of enemies getting stuck between buildings, making them hard to find sometimes. Most of the missions are chaotic, but some of the most chaotic missions included numerous huge explosions. These were very cool to see, but they sometimes slowed the frame rate way down for a short period.
Earth Defense Force 4.1 The Shadow of New Despair is a fantastic game. Playing EDF feels exactly how you might remember playing games as a kid. It's got an old-school fun factor that lets you decide how you want to play and how easy or hard you want it to be. Everything feels like it was designed around the simple premise of having fun. From the campy story, complete with larger-than-life visuals, to the large selection of unique, fun-to-use weapons. It has simple gameplay that can be enjoyed by anyone. It loses nothing by including split-screen co-op, and it's so much fun you'll want to share the experience with a friend. It encourages co-op play at every turn, and is one of the best local co-op games we've ever played. If you're ever in the mood for awesome sci-fi action made of pure fun, and have someone you'd like to join you, this is one we'd recommend.
Yes, sir! Did you tell her you love her?